I'm Matt O'Neill, former U.S. Secret Service Deputy Special Agent in charge of cyber operations. In this series, I go inside the fight against cybercrime, hearing directly from the defenders in government, infrastructure, and enterprise who are racing to stay ahead, because cybercrime isn't slowing down, and neither can we. Welcome to Detonation Point, presented by Elastio. My guest this week is Natalie Loebner. Natalie, thank you so much for joining us. Can you kind of give the audience just a little background about yourself?
Sure. Yeah, I'm excited to talk with you here, Matt. Yeah, I have a bit of a meandering professional background. I have my academic training is in mathematics. I ended up going to law school, was with the U.S. Attorney's Office in Alabama and with tax division. I've worked with private firms, really just money related, from tax to money laundering, asset forfeiture, bankruptcy. But the thing that really tied everything together was data, analyzing evidence that was electronic, which during my career has really grown. And for the last 5 years, I pivoted more to consulting directly with the agents rather than, sometimes I describe it to you, just kind of shoving toothpaste back in the tube at the litigation phase, but hopefully in a more proactive kind of manner. So I was with a firm, and then I went out on my own about 3 years ago. And I really just like helping people think strategically and removing that black box of mystery. My goal is for people I work with to feel smart and not to feel overwhelmed.
How do you like having your own company compared to what you've done in the past?
I love it. I mean, it's so liberating. I mean, I have a busy mind. I like putting my
Yeah.
fingers kind of in a whole different kinds of topics, and working for myself lets me both control my time and have that opportunity to deep dive just to kind of grow professionally or just in my interests. So I do a lot of pro bono work and nonprofit support and just kind of like thinking through challenges. Sometimes it is useful in my work and sometimes not so much. So a lot of kind of stuff we interact is, oh, I read this thing, where can I help? And so working for myself lets me protect that time. So I'm not, filling it with other kinds of just busy work. So it's
Yeah.
been kind of life changing in all the good ways.
It's wonderful to hear. I try to talk to as many retiring feds, recently retired feds as possible, or state and locals as well, to say you should consider it because there is nothing more empowering than working for yourself. It's all stuff we can do. None of this is rocket science. And instead of just going out and, being employee 800 for some nameless, faceless corporation, you are yourself and you get to pick what you want to do, stuff you're passionate about, and it just brings joy to your life every day. One of the things that we talk often about is like normalization of data, and you're always the first to point out, rightly so. Whereas, like, hey, we have these big ideas to fix these things, but yet we're not getting the small things right. Whether it's, and we'll talk about like subpoena, like all of that kind of stuff. Going back even more basic, it got me thinking about from our last conversation, do we even have the right language that we're using when we talk about frauds and scams and losses and all of that stuff? Do you think that there is a disconnect in the communication and the words and the language that we're using to describe this current scam epidemic?
I do personally, because I feel like I'm pretty steeped in the space and I have to read certain sentences multiple times, go into the footnote, double check a report just to make sure I understand what people are talking about. Is a fraud and a scam, every kind of intent to deceive, which is a huge umbrella. Is it this kind of organized crime scam? Is it an improper payment? I see that term get used where sometimes even an underpayment in government for government fraud is considered improper, and just not being very specific about what we're talking about. And I think it really undercuts arguments for fixing the problem, because saying a $5 billion problem is 5 times greater than it is sort of unnecessary. It's a big problem. We need to fix it. And making it sound bigger than it is allows for criticism of your basic argument to make people look less credible. So that's an area I think we all just probably can be more surgical about, is what are we talking about? Um, is we were just when we were chatting, it was sort of people talk past each other, where we might be talking about organized crime syndicates targeting Americans, and then you hear banks talk about first party fraud from their customers or refund fraud, and I go, yeah, they're all fraud, but they're really different in what are we talking about here, and the solution for, one-off customers or elder fraud by family members or a caretaker is very different from an international syndicate mass spamming people and sending them to fake websites. The treatment and the signal and how we kind of triage it are not the same. So yeah, I get a little lost in the fraud
Yeah.
conversation myself, and I feel like I have a good expertise in the space.
I feel the same way. We talk about fraud, scams, swindles, as you said, first party fraud, authorized push payment fraud. It just gets so confusing to the average person. No wonder why people in Congress haven't really looked at it all that much, because when I've had conversations with legislators or their staff, they get the conflation of fraud against the government as opposed to fraud or scams against consumers, and then it just kind of makes it more difficult. Who would be in you, if there was a perfect sort of world, like, who would set the standard definitions, so at least we're talking about the same things?
I mean, I hope it would be Congress. They're going to be deciding laws for the purpose of, an ability for an individual, the ability for a government side to go address the issue. But maybe Congress is looking to us and think tanks or other people. It's kind of cyclical, but anybody could define it. I think more specifically to make it work. At least for the frauds and scams in the coordinated space, we're looking for safe harbors to share information. We're looking for authorities to make arrests, to pause payments, to do things to protect people. You don't want that for every kind of transaction under the sun. Um, because fraud can just be like a disclosure statement if they intended to make you pay for something that you weren't. Like, we don't need the same treatment for our individual kind of personal activity versus sort of this national security threat. The other area where I don't quite understand why we're not pulling the two together is the money laundering aspect and wire fraud, where most scams that I've seen require the movement of fraud proceeds, which ties right into that area. And that I think that's another reason why it's not defined super well is businesses when it's the second stage of fraud, not just there's a loss to the person or to the company, but when it's moving, there's fees and accounts and activities that all the intermediaries get to either put on their investor statements or their books. And so it gets very conflated for the same activity. Where does it go in sort of the larger ecosystem? Because once you move proceeds of fraud, you're in a whole other kind of criminal statute context as well.
It's interesting because when we talked last, and we went down this rabbit hole a little bit on as it relates to safe harbor 314B, we both recognize that federal statutes define in 18 USC 1029 access device fraud what fraud is. Like, we get all that. So there are definitions, but they're not standard applied from the title authority, title 18, all the way through to like what average people are talking about. And that's again part of the problem. It's also when you talk about safe harbor and the fees, one of the things that I was on a webinar just last week, and the refrain was banks want more clarity on 314B of the USA Patriot Act because they can share information bank to bank as it relates to money laundering or terrorism, but yet money laundering has those specified unlawful activities. The second one is fraud. And you and I went down this rabbit hole as to what each of the subsets were. And there is enough gray area for institutions to be cautious. Do you have the same sort of opinion?
I mean, I can appreciate their caution because there's huge liabilities for disclosing outside of a safe harbor. I think I was a little shocked coming out of from the DOJ mindset that this wasn't something that institutions were doing. I just assumed, oh, it's a specified unlawful act. You're moving proceeds of fraud. Of course they can. And I really thought that the hang up of 314B, and this is something we've talked about, you can't request share beyond just one to one. Like maybe there's six institutions or an institution in a money service business and a P2P, and you want to do sharing more in real time across multiple institutions. I kind of thought that was more the operational issue, not we're not sharing for fraud. So it kind of makes me nervous that that's where we're actually at, where the problem is. Because I think it's bigger. Even if we solve this clarity, we're not done. We're not getting where we need to be.
Well, and it's also interesting because two things. One, you said about the liability if you're sharing outside safe harbor. When we asked our friends in the regulation space, specifically OCC, they said, "Find us time where that's ever happened." And they said they couldn't find one. I've been asking everybody, show me an instance where a bank was dinged or harmed or fined for sharing outside of 314B like improperly, and nobody can find it. So if a listener has one, please send it our way because I'll change the narrative a little bit, see what that looks like. But it seems like it's a little bit of a red herring. The other piece is when I ask banks, have you asked for clarity from FinCEN? Like you have strong lobbying groups. Have they asked? Because Director Gackey testified in September, the House Financial Services Committee. One of the members asked specifically about 314B and having more clarity. And Director Gackey said, we'll look into it. Nobody's really asked. So then that begs the question, do they really want the clarity?
Yeah, and, on top of that, in 2020, FinCEN had the 314, kind of FAQ guidance that said, fraud against individuals is contemplated. There is something from FinCEN, to say if we wanted to say yes, it's there. I just think the sharing that's needed, and I know you're of the same mindset. Like, fine, we solved 314. It's optional. It doesn't include all the same entities. If MSBs don't have account ID checks at account opening like banks, you're sharing at different qualities and validity of data. So there's a whole lot of modernization that even if everybody exists at the floor of safe harbors, we're still not where we need to be to address, what I believe, but again, because it's hard to know as they define the fraud, this organized criminal operations where they're targeting Americans and committing fraud at scale with high volume. If we're looking to stop that, we have to get on the same page across all the different information and money rails, which we're not. We're not there at all.
So last December, you and I talked a lot because I was going to testify in front of the House Administration about money laundering. And you really opened my eyes about all of the fintechs and MSBs that are not covered under BSA. Can you walk the listeners of just about how wide the gap is and how easy it is to launder money if you're a bad actor?
Yeah. So a lot of MSBs, they're under the BSA, but not the same as a bank. So a bank, if you want to open an account, even if you don't have a dollar in it, they have different know your customer and customer due diligence obligations. And that's why, it can feel sometimes frustrating for people today to say, oh, I have to go in person to open my bank account. A lot of them still require that to mitigate, their liability. Whereas an MSB, money service business, and that can be your check cashers, your money orders, all the way to kind of like the P2P payment apps and different bill pay, payroll services, all of them might be in this non-bank financial institution space. They have triggering thresholds when they open an account. So if I just want to send small dollars, I'm not having to provide all this identity. And they allow you to do it online, and it may not be as robust. I just need to provide them a phone number or an email. That may not really be a good way for them to know I am me, or that phone number isn't tied to a synthetic identity in the credit reporting authority data or whatever they're using to verify. And there are a number of consent orders that came out of New York Department of Finance, that talk about these duplicate accounts where an individual or some organized group controls, 20,000 accounts because they're connected to the same device IDs, or, they have multiple phones just on a rack. We've seen some pictures in the news. There's signals that you can use to identify when those clusters are happening. The duplicate account is an issue, and requiring identity, requiring stronger verification, maybe one time in person a year, something like that would mitigate a lot of that. But they're not required to. It's not illegal that they don't. That's just what the law is. And then there are other kinds of non-bank financial institutions that aren't allowing customer to send money, but it's like business to business, or payment processors are kind of these intermediaries that help connect banks to all these fintechs. And there are a number of FinCEN advisories that say if you're just kind of doing merchant to merchant, regulated entity to regulated entity, you don't have to file anything. But one regulated entity might be this MSB that has the lighter security into a bank. So if I use some sort of tap to pay or point of sale, there's a number of different large companies that offer those, and there are a couple big intermediaries. They flow into a bank, and the bank doesn't have as much insight into everybody using a credit card, everybody using this crowdsource website, all the rails. And if you had a criminal syndicate let's say like selling contraband or smuggling children or doing something, but they're using a fake website to take payment, like a house rental or kind of like your crafts sale site. I may have my co-conspirators make purchases on the site through their credit cards. It flows through, and the bank may have no insight into what's going on. And so it's even if I had a whistleblower come in and tell me exactly what was going on, to collect the information and put it in front of a jury at like a high school level, I'm going to have 11 subpoenas. Some of them are going to produce data files that make no sense to me. Some of them are going to produce PDFs that I have to, use OCR tools to put into a system. I mean, we're talking months and months of very cumbersome analysis to demonstrate to a jury something that I know that happened, let alone discover the things I don't know that are happening. I don't know if that explanation was clear
Yeah.
enough, but it overwhelms me when I think about having to kind of trace those funds, given the lack of standards
What
for with.
about you mentioned a little bit about crowdsourcing, about the ability to launder money through those GoFundMe type sites and things like that. How easy is it? And have we seen evidence that bad actors are taking advantage of what seems to be, once you explain it to me, a pretty obvious way to move money?
Yeah, I think it's very high risk and it's hard. Like a crowdsourcing site is going to have a partnership with a bank, right? Because they're a non-bank financial institution, but they need a bank account. So there's a bank, but that bank just has kind of like a general account for the crowdsourcing website. They don't know all the different people that have signed up to crowdsource. So that's the crowdsourcing site's customers. So it's the bank's customers. So the bank doesn't have to know that level. And then your crowdsourcing people are going to have a customer's customer, all the people donating money. So if you're a bad actor, you have MSBs with different reduced thresholds of oversight that now are incredibly pervasive and areas where most of us do more banking than we've ever, or payments than we ever have before. Now has sort of the lightest AML, and the entities that have the highest level screening don't have transparency downstream into what's going on. They don't know who's a OFAC, who's a known bad flyer, who's dealing outside of tolerances for the information that they have. So it's very siloed. And I don't, like to set up a GoFundMe page, it doesn't take much, right? It doesn't take much to set up those accounts. It doesn't take much to get money in. It's not, it's easier than setting up a bank account, I think, these days.
It sounds to me somewhat similar to a nested exchange in a virtual asset service provider, where if somebody's starting to look, they're looking and saying, "Oh, well, that belongs to name the crowdsourcing site," but it doesn't get you a lot more details. So one of the things that you mentioned last time we chatted is about encouraging law enforcement to send additional legal process to some of these places. From your experience, what's the average agent and analyst missing right now in their investigations? Where should they be sending, not specifically the name of the companies, but where should be in the whole follow the money thing, where should they be looking?
So, I think it depends on the case, right? But if you have communications on a phone, like you've seized the phone and there's chats or there's things on either encrypted or social media, and there's kind of that metadata. You've got timing, you've got dates, you have IPs, you have device IDs. If you're not also subpoenaing that kind of metadata from the financial institutions, you're missing an opportunity to connect transactions to the context, right? We want to know who, what, where, when, why, tied to the elements of the crime. So if I can say, $5,000 or $1 million moved from person A to person B, what's the intent, right? If I can tie that to the same phone or computer that also texted, I'm going to send you this, or have a communication before or after that references that transaction, that is more evidence to put into court. And, if in fact that metadata is consistent, in a pretty tight time box, you can overcome things like, I don't know what you're talking about. That wasn't my phone. I was hacked. I mean, there's a lot of defenses that can be refuted if we're getting that sort of richer data, not just what's on a PDF bank statement that is a view of the core banking system that has lots of transactional information. But if the bank you're subpoenaing, is dealing with kind of these fintechs, the P2P, even credit cards that detail the line item swipe of what was purchased is not at the bank. It's at the merchant. It's at the credit card holder. So there's lots of other, if it's a website, who are the customers? The bank doesn't know, but these other parties do. So it really kind of depends on, is it material to your investigation? You don't want to just waste your time going down rabbit holes. But yeah, if that's kind of what you're facing, I don't see the standard subpoena that I was provided as a go by that says give me the bank statements to be sufficient to get all this kind of necessary proof.
I had prosecutors who used to say, "We're trying to defeat the SOTI defense. Some other dude did it." And so trying to get that additional data is really important. We talk a lot about some of the grist and the challenges in working these cases from the technological standpoint if you're law enforcement, which creates a lot of unnecessary delays. And we know that money is moving faster than ever. Bad actors are always trying to stay one, two, three steps ahead. What do you see as the biggest challenges right now to law enforcement in tracing, tracking financial crime?
Yeah, that there isn't a good, like, unique, persistent transaction ID, right? And that's something the regulators or someone outside of law enforcement, has to decide is worthwhile. But one of the things we learned from crypto, I think you'll hear plenty of law enforcement say, hey, we can trace it, we can find it. It's because I want to send something from wallet A to wallet B. There's a unique hash that is persistent with the sending and receiving wallet. We don't have that in banks. If I have, my bank and you have a different bank and I send you money, I'm going to get a PDF from my bank and a PDF from your bank, and I have two different documents that reference one transaction. But if I wanted to stick it in a system and do programmatic, more automated tracing of just saying, show me the flow, it's not very easy because the computer's looking for those joins. Like if there was a unique transaction that bank A just sent in the file and kept at bank B, the bank would, your program can say, when does this transaction match? And that's in the simplest. Sometimes you have correspondent banking, intermediary banking, you have time zone differences, there's fees. And so, having that unique identifier follow a transaction or at least kind of daisy chain through would allow you to get a bunch of records, dump it in a system, show me the transaction flows, not just at the account level, but more at the granular level. But that's not something we can do very cleanly right now with the information provided. There's companies out there that I think do the best they can, and can show tracing with some kind of error percentage there. But like if I was a defense attorney, I'd drive a truck through it. So what you need is the actual evidence that's admissible. And the best way to do that would be for whoever's job, whether it's the regulators or Congress, to say, look, putting one more data column isn't as expensive as it used to be. Add it to the transaction file. And then now when things go wrong, we can find it.
Until you brought that to my attention last year, it never even dawned on me, which is funny because, as you mentioned, there's transaction hashes in following digital assets, but yet it never occurred to me, why don't we have that in banking and how much easier would it be? You also mentioned the PDFs and sort of like the inconsistency in getting the data back from financial institutions or other subpoenaed organizations. How much of a challenge is that to law enforcement?
Think it's a big challenge if you have to solve it in every case, right? If we don't come out of my investigation, because I spent a lot of time on it. I had a lot of high volume cases where I was just not going to do it well if I got PDFs. Yes, it's a digital record, but it's not the electronic evidence. And so that's something that I kind of struggle with other lawyers, is to say, yes, this is a digital record, it's a PDF, but it's like a digital document, not data. And those are distinct evidence types. And so if I'm even having to have that debate with my colleague next door, at DOJ, then you're having that discussion with the attorney on the other side. And what do they do? And they haven't ever heard this before. It's added weeks to my cases. If I have to depose someone from the institution and kind of say, look, you want to go in front of the court and tell them, if your VP of sales wants a data file and a dashboard about transactions and who's doing what kind of purchases, so you can build your next financial product, but you tell law enforcement you got PDFs. I mean, I'm going to win that discovery dispute 99% of the time, but that's a waste of time. And no agent wants to waste that time in their case. I think it's very few and far between, and you're having some very extreme cases. And we've had wins, when we're talking with banks, some of them agree to it. But the challenge is a headquarters focused, collaborative approach. And institutions, there's so many, there's like 4,600 banks, 2,300 credit unions, 45,000 non-bank financial institutions, that are registered. Give them some clarity. Say, here are the 20, here are the 30. I don't know how many fields, it is that most of the cases need. Create a pre-can report that when there's a subpoena, put the date, range, and your account number or whatever the parameters are, and populate the fields that are relevant and that you have. That's what would reduce barriers for law enforcement is expectation. I'm also not really sure because when I would look at kind of like FinCEN supporting documents, they have a lot of rich data. I'm not getting thousands of PDFs there. Why is that not part of an effective anti-money laundering program that if I want to, I'm like, great job. You found the case. Like, I'm going to go pursue this and have a case. Why am I getting not the best evidence, for court now that I'm in the legal process world? That disconnect to me was always confusing. I don't think it's intentional. I think it's just a lack of strategic discussion and coordination that the government and private sector just need to come to the table on. I think it's very fixable.
One of the things that always makes me optimistic after I talk to you is many of these challenges are solvable. We're just not doing it. So it's not like it's beyond our grasp right now. It's just beyond our will to do it. You mentioned this sheer size of, I guess, the financial world in the United States, which to me sounds like a huge attack surface. Is that part of the problem where it's maybe in smaller countries it's not, you don't have that much ability to move money across so many different sectors. So are they successful in operating in the gaps in our system?
Some extent, yes. I think the volume adds complexity, but there's a lot of standardization. I mean, a lot of the small banks use the same core vendors. There's not 4,000 core vendors out there. They have ISO and X9, transactional standards. They use clearing houses where all of them at some point their data gets normalized. Like I don't, at least for the subpoena and the data side, I think it's just guidance as to how to prepare for those kinds of requests in advance because it can take time to build a pre-can report and to do it in an exigent time frame is not the best time to do it, especially when all you want to do is save a victim. There's like very serious issues going on. You don't always have the patience to work with the bank employee who is doing the best they have with what's in front of them, but it's maybe not the right employee to talk to. They need to go higher level and get that kind of investment. In terms of, I think maybe your other question, which is, does this allow an exploit? That to me, that's different than responding to subpoenas. That's just saying we have a lot of different products. There are inconsistent standards for entry. The non-bank financial institution side, where you can sign up for an account with a phone number or an email, or just rely on credit reporting authority data that isn't always accurate to let people into the financial system. Yeah, that adds a lot of complexity and difficulty. And any time that you can increase scalability. Online makes things easier. I don't have to be in person. I don't have to have a lot of co-conspirators to move a lot of money if I have multiple phones. Yeah, that adds difficulty for exploits.
Another area of that's exploitable is our identity verification and credit reporting. Can you tell the listeners just how bad it is?
Yeah, I mean it's hard. I mean, we have 50 states and territories that issue identities. There's not like a federal driver's license. We have a social, maybe, but only if, like you bought it when you were born. I think it's like your certificate costs $25. So maybe not everyone has even their social security certificate. But private sector companies can't just go to the government as easily and say, this, Matt's identity. Like, I'm not going to go to the State Department. I'm going to rely on, these kind of third party vendors that kind of collect digital dust. The Federal Reserve Board had a report in 2019 that looked at synthetic identities, and we're noting that rejections in the aggregate became records, right? So if you have a synthetic identity that has 3 rejections, with the name and kind of combination of attributes, the fourth person to check that is going to see a record. And so we don't require credit authorities to have to disclose this is a record of rejections. Then, like, what do we do with that? Or we don't have the government coming in and saying, these are fake IDs. You need to delete these, right? You can't sell this to a bank. You can't sell this to landlords to do that. Some of the work I was talking to you about the Debt Bondage Repair Act, which was a law passed, in 2021 to help victims of human trafficking, smuggling, sex trafficking. A lot of times their handlers are taking their identities and applying for mortgages and applying for credit cards and driving up a lot of financial issues. That law allowed them to essentially expunge those um, records when they were a victim. If they could get the right letter from law enforcement or government, and there's all sorts of issues of how easy and not easy it is to kind of get the relief that this law was intended to provide. But the law said you can clear it on the full 9-digit, your name and date of birth. But we're still seeing that if there's synthetics where the last four, which you might give to your employer or your landlord, kind of the fuzzy match, they're still in there. It's not cleaning everything. We don't actually know all the different references that some third party company might check against us, which makes it easy for bad actors to kind of create these portfolios that we're not going to get on our annual credit check. We can't correct. So, yeah, the credit reporting, I think, needs some updating to make sure that we have the ability to check our identities in full and correct them and make sure that the ones that shouldn't be in there in the first place, because there's no such person, aren't in there for the purchase.
Well, and then also when you talk about the file SSN, the input SSN, the file SSN at a credit reporting agency, they might have 20 of the same social security numbers tied to 20 different people, but it's the same number, which speaks to the problem. How is that possible? And also with synthetics, I was always shocked by the season trade line business and how that is flourishing. Is that something that you've ever spent any time looking at? Is season trade lines?
No, that's like a
Oh,
whole
it's
new term
crazy.
for me. Yeah.
Okay, so a season trade line is so you have a credit card, you have a Amex, it's been around 20 years, right? Or what name the credit card, and you can have authorized users, right? And so what will happen is you can attach a synthetic to an authorized user. Therefore, as transactions are happening, it artificially inflates their credit score to help them basically obtain credit and a better credit score to essentially bust it out downstream. I did not realize that people sold their authorized user kind of status to credit cards to third parties who then find other people in order to do it to exploit the system. And also, you could have up to 20 authorized users on an account in some instances. So to me, that's just bananas. Like, why are we allowing this to happen? At the end of the day, it's who would suffer the loss in a synthetic. It gets very confusing, and it's a crazy sort of rabbit hole to go down. Is the whole season trade line sales, authorized user, the whole fix your credit kind of thing, and how they do it. It really helps propagate synthetic identity theft.
Yeah. I mean, I was aware of that in sort of the shelf LLC where there's just kind of registered agents out there creating LLCs, and you could buy one that's 20 years old because a bank will look they research the company's more seasoned. Yeah. And that kind of goes to, like what is identity? Is it just your name and a date of birth? Is it kind of the trustworthiness of an entity? Like I think we think about identity in a pretty basic way, but there are more nuanced kind of ways to approach it. Like I really don't want every website to know my credit card number and my date of birth and all this stuff. Like you just need to know that this token, of my reference to my credit card account is valid and I'm the right person to be using it, which is different than if I go to a bar. You just need to know I'm over 21 and you shouldn't know anything about me, kind of thing. That we haven't really explored different ways of protecting people's privacy and also making things more secure. And it's requires investment, which is a hard thing to motivate companies to do. And I think that's where policymakers, have an important role to play is they can create those carrots and sticks for doing things, right? Like liability or indemnity or different kinds of who holds the loss drives what companies do. Kind of like in the 70s when they wanted people to use credit cards, there's a lot of consumer protection for us to use credit cards because it was cheaper for the institutions to not have to deal with all the cash. But we're not seeing that today. Like, people seem really excited to just use something new rather than something secure. I don't know what you do about population kind of groupthink on that size. That's a hard one to overcome.
And I think the answer to all the questions is always money. And so when you wonder why something hasn't happened, the next question is, well, who's making money off of the current system? Right. So if who is pushing back against true digital identity verification? Who is against having people's credit frozen by default? What is the consequences of that? Who's losing money? And that'll tell you the reason why it hasn't happened, which is unfortunate, but it's also something that you talked about before with me is people want to be early adopters. And so people will throw themselves into new technology without ever thinking about the downstream consequences. Also in social media. Whereas you mentioned, like, I don't want the bartender to know my DOB and and I get all that. At the same time, most of us are putting that out there for them anyway. How big of a problem, from where you sit as a former prosecutor in DOJ to what you're doing now, how much of a role does social media play in the current sort of problems that we're facing?
Well, I think in terms of like the data privacy, I go broader in sort of like technology and what is sort of permissible data usage, sharing, reselling. I think there's a lot of ambiguity that doesn't track today's operation. So data gets out there. I think social media is so prevalent because it's an area where you develop trust. If you're going to be giving a lot of money to someone, there's some trust that's developed. So social media is a place where people are maybe inappropriately finding connections and trust. I mean, there's a lot of positives. I think that's kind of the trick, right? You have to explore both the operational good of these tools and be clear-eyed about the exploits and be reasonable about what we should be doing. And I think most people sit in one camp or the other, and very few are saying, yeah, like teen sextortion, like these teen sponsor accounts are driving. Like, if you look at sort of the Javelin or the Stanford study, there are three companies that are big vectors of those exploit payments, um, that have caused like suicides and all these things. And you're like, why do kids need all these payment apps? Well, there are good reasons, right? You don't want your kids robbed on the street because they're having a bunch of cash, right? Maybe it's safer that they just have a phone that they can tap to pay. Maybe that is better. They have jobs, whether it's babysitting or lifeguarding, and their employers want to do, direct deposit for whatever reason. They don't have a bank account. There are people where that is an issue. So there are positive reasons for these things that have bad outcomes. And what are we doing to kind of minimize the harms and maximize the good without getting too caught up of like defending the status quo, right? And I think, was it I think it was Matt or Tinder, I think came out this last week saying that they were going to just do duplicate account deletions by doing more facial recognition. Great. So now if you're going to be a scammer, you got to be one account. Hopefully that they get that right. That's harder, right? As opposed to me having 100 accounts or 1,000 accounts and having a bigger attack vector. Like, honestly, like, I'm glad they're doing it now. Probably should have happened a couple years ago, but that's kind of that middle ground that I don't see a lot of companies coming to the table in earnest. And then a lot of the people going after the problems sometimes have a hard time seeing why this product is good, what the value is bringing, and how do we have those reasonable discussions. It feels like you're either in one echo chamber or the other. Maybe you have a different experience, but that's kind of how I feel. It's we're talking at each other and having these arguments rather than real solutioning.
Yeah. It's also looking back about, again, the answer to the question is money, and you look at the incentivization. So if you deplatform 100,000 paid accounts, shareholders are going to be like, why are our losses down this quarter? We cleaned it up. Guess what? That also means my stock is down and I don't like it. And also bonuses are tied to income and things like that. So you look at that, and then same thing on social media. What is the incentivization to deep-platform accounts? I always say often, if you're not paying for it, you're the product, you're not the customer. What is their incentivization to clean up the product? They want to show as much usage as possible with as many different accounts as possible. So cleaning it up is not necessarily, and again, I'll get into talking past people who are like dedicated like fraud professionals. And I'm like, I don't mean you. I just mean your company is there to make money. And the thing that they make money off of is how many people are online, how often, like how addicted. I'm typically in the camp of social media is probably the worst thing that happened to society in the last 150 years, except for in law enforcement, it's really easy to develop networks. So it makes my life so much easier. Hey, how do I know that my bad guy knows this person? Well, they're on Instagram and they tag each other. So thank you very much. You just made my life easier. But at the same time, bad actors are doing that to victims as well. And
Yeah.
so we have opened that attack surface where I've arrested many of fraudster that told me I went on their Facebook account. That's how I found out what high school they went to answer that two-factor authentication or that, that knowledge-based authentication question, things like that. Like we're giving the answers to the questions and we don't even realize that we're doing it.
Yeah. I think we do a disservice generally in education, helping people understand this. I think I had a real crash course in my early 20s right after graduating college. I was a paralegal for a law firm, and my job is just to read thousands of executives' emails. I mean, I learned everything about them thinking, why would you put this in your business email? Why would you have affairs in your business email? Why would you talk about this in your business email? And it sets the stage for my professional life of, oh, I should be really mindful about what I put because nothing's private, right? It's just not. And so I don't know that we train everybody to think about it that way. It's fine, right? We should go out and meet people. We should have communities. You should have friends. We're a social kind of group. If you move a lot, like I come from a military family, like social media has been really good to stay in touch with people where we move a lot. It's helped, stay in touch with family that maybe we would have had to write letters or phone calls and it's difficult with time zone. I mean, I think there are a lot of good positives, but it takes a savvy, deliberate approach to using it and an appropriate usage. And like one of my son's friends was saying, "Oh, will you teach a Girl Scout troop about cybersecurity?" Or, I think there's a lot more opportunities for us to teach, our next generation to be smarter about this. What do you put online? What tools do you sign up for? If it's free, think about it. I always read those terms of service. I mean, there's probably a number of people that get plenty of emails like, have you heard about this company? And if you looked at the data thing, do you know if they're keeping this list? And I think we learn pretty hard, a lot of people learn pretty harshly with the 23andMe bankruptcy is that's a business asset. And it doesn't matter what your contract says today. Anybody could buy it later in a bankruptcy. I mean, they chose not to in this case, but that could be the case with all sorts of company lists, right? Any startup, all these apps, I mean, it's purchasable
Yeah.
through not just like the but an exception to the data broker sharing is acquisition, right? Merger.
Yeah, I look back at social media and think, my generation, I know you're 25 years younger than me, but our generation is the last to know what it was like before it. And I feel like people that have grown up on social media and that are digitally native have lost in some degree the interpersonal relationships, the ability to have conversations, real conversations. A lot of the newer generation, like the phone rings and it's like, what are you calling me for? Why don't you just send me a text? And so that I do see the benefits as you're talking about being connected, but I also feel like there's also the other side where how superficial are those connections in some instances, and do the and I'm not a sociologist, I don't know, but I suspect that in many instances, if the relationships are hanging on by not familial, but just general relationships are just hanging on only because of social media, it seems like we've lost something, maybe a bit of a society, and maybe part of the big lack of real like good discourse is because of that, because we're being fed only things that you mentioned earlier, echo chambers. We're only being fed what we want to see. We don't have any tolerance for other people's opinions anymore because you're just being fed and funneled, and they understand what your dopamine hits are and they understand what you want to see, and then you just become addicted to it. And that didn't happen, when I got my Sports Illustrated once a week back in the 1980s.
But I'll say part of that's a design, right? I read a really interesting book called Mind Masters by I think it's Sandra Matz. And she said, like, yeah, you have algorithms, but the same company could let you choose which algorithm you want, right? I could choose to have Crazy Uncle Frank's view of the internet. Like you look at Google and do a search and you think it's the dictionary, but I do it and I'm going to get a different result than you because we have a different digital profile. We don't control what that is. If you're knowledgeable about it, like for me, coming from the math and the data, go, oh yeah, like it's just classifying on the back end data and this is what it's doing. And I could tweak the algorithm because I can make 700 searches this way and I'll just create a bot that like half of it is I'm just like mucking around, seeing like, what does Google think of me this week? I'll play, I'll show things like because I understand that. But it would be cool if I could turn on exploratory mode, or I could say I want to see it like somebody I really disagree with. Like I could push back and say there could be uses of it in the positive. We're not given those uses today. I thought that presentation of it was kind of neat, and it is a driver of money, right? So if money is the driver, then sometimes they need a different carrot and stick kind of incentive to say what's the public good and where's the line above my pay grade to say what those
Yeah.
things are, like how much of it is customer due diligence and how much of it is sound infrastructure or safe dealing. I think they're really heady, nuanced, pick your lane and then we kind of deal with how to live in it kind of discussions, but we're not having them at that level, right? We're fighting about this is good, this is bad in a very binary kind of discussion, like politics. It's a light switch, it's on or off. And I'm like, welcome to the world of the dimmer switch. Like we have 365 unlimited set of dial tweaks that we can come to here. That's where I'd rather be is in that space than the yes, no, good, bad.
Is that the mathematician in you? Is that do you
Maybe.
think? Yeah. Because a lot of, like, trial attorneys are pretty, I mean, it's black and white, but you have a much more nuanced look at some of the challenges that we face today. What
Yeah, I think in a trial sense, you're like, this is the law, right? If
Yeah,
you say, I have freedom to define what the law is, it's very broad. I think if we're in the four corners of what do I have to prove today? And, do I have am I in civil court? Is it a 51% likelihood or
right,
is this a, you know,
right.
90% kind of more than a reasonable doubt, beyond a reasonable doubt kind of thing. Like, yeah, it gets very black and white, but I'm in a box then. I have set these are the facts, this is the law. But I think on policy, I think we have a lot of opportunity to improve things and think creatively and make space for innovation, but also really think about customer burden, consumer safety, national security. I mean, just putting customer data kind of like, yeah, that's on them and good luck reading my 400-page terms of service. But now you have nation states buying packages on our military, right? It's out there. They know who's had a bankruptcy. They know whose spouse might have, had to move and not, got the same job. There's a lot of information about us that can be used against us that I think is kind of terrifying.
It is.
And I think once we think about it as a national security and national strategy, maybe we can come together and have a better discussion about it.
So to wrap up, what are you most concerned about, and what are you most optimistic about in the next 5 years as it comes to the space that you and I live in every single day?
I think what I'm most concerned about is inertia, right? Or being paralyzed. I think we've seen a lot of paralysis in dealing with what's coming and things that are changing, and not enough. Let's just make it better rather than perfect. Like it's okay. We just have to take steps and we have to keep taking steps as opposed to, I just need to write the perfect law and then we'll move on. Like that's never solved anything. It's never going to be the way that it's going to be. Like it's just a constant amount of work and effort. And that's just what it needs to be. And we have to do it. Right. So the inertia, being overwhelmed, being paralyzed isn't happening, isn't going away. We have to start moving together in a strategic manner. And I'm okay, even if it isn't my perfect solution, as long as we're doing something, which we're not quite. We're not optimistic. I really think there are some very low hanging fruit, easy, kind of like, let's just come to the table and say, what do you need to to do your job, like to private sector to say what do you need to make things easier. They're talking about information sharing, they're talking about safe harbors to say we want to protect customers. Law enforcement, at least my like they ask for a lot of things, but I think they should be asking for cleaner
Mhm.
electronic data so they can do the stuff that takes months in minutes and then work on the next thing and not buy AI and technology solutions instead of doing easy data fixes, right? If we use that to join accounts instead of putting transactional identifiers, like we're using heavy compute for stupid reasons, and there's other places to use that technology. I guess I'm maybe nervous about that. I'm nervous about, can you get people that don't live in data to not get nervous about the data, not just regurgitate kind of this, we got to use AI, we got to use technology, and feel it's pretty common sense. Like, if you don't have labeled data, it's not going to work, right? We just can't, it's not magic. It's just not magic. And at a basic level, there are some things like OpenAI and ChatGPT, they're using a labeled data set of the internet that they've been classifying for 20 years, right? With English speaking
Mhm.
foreigners, with every time they say click on the bicycle or the stoplight, like years and years of data training. Like, we can't skip that step. But I don't think in the financial space it's going to take 20 years. I think we could do it in a year if we decided it's a priority.
And that's what makes me optimistic because when you look at these big problems, you have this unique ability to boil it down into smaller, easier steps that will make that big problem less. And that's what makes me
Yes.
optimistic because I think it's we can get overwhelmed by the problem. And you're so right. We don't need giant solutions. Those are helpful in certain areas, but we need very basic common sense things like as we started with normalization of terminology, normalization of data, normalization of labeling, and that will go a long way to solve those bigger problems.
Yeah.
So
In math and compute, it can do amazing stuff. Like, I just remember losing my mind what a formula could do. Have like blinking lights of a firefly, and you stick all this data in there, and it tells you when they all start blinking in unison in like 2 seconds. Like, that's amazing, right? I could never look at this data table and tell you what point in time this month with all these things. It can find amazing patterns, but I had to feed it in that data that someone logged about counting the number of fireflies and when they blinked on and off and whatever they're using to do that. And it's logical and it makes sense. And we just have to apply that same tactic to this area. But yeah, I don't know, Matt. It's like I'm optimistic and then I'm not at the same time. But you know, I think the tide is turning a bit. Like, law enforcement wants to help people. I think people are not wanting the status quo. I think businesses are getting a sense that their bottom lines are going to start hurting. Like, I think that's why we're seeing that with the dating apps. They're like, oh, people aren't using it anymore. We have to make it safer. Like, maybe things just have to get a little worse in certain areas before we get there, which is a shame. But sometimes that's what happens.
yeah, I'm an eternal optimist on basically everything. I start every round of golf thinking I'm going to shoot even par and never happens. But I am an eternal optimist because I can't see a world living just being a pessimist. That doesn't solve any problems. Thinking that we can make meaningful changes because we can. There's no reason why we can't. We've shown it time and time again that as a collective we can do really good things if we have the will to do it. And you're right. I think it's probably going to get a little worse before it gets better, but we're really close, hopefully, to rock bottom. So,
Yeah, but there, maybe I'm
I mean,
optimistic.
yeah, yeah. So, no, well, Natalie Loebner, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate you as a friend. You're always a great resource, and I look forward to seeing and working with you in the future. So, thank you
Yeah,
so much for joining us.
it's mutual. Thanks for inviting me on.
So,
This has been fun. Yeah.
yeah, thank you, and thank you to the listeners for listening to Detonation Point presented by Elastio. If you enjoyed the show, please share it, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you.